All right, so my talk today is going to be a bit different than typical Outlook talk, but because this is an Outlook conference, I am going to start with a couple of slides and talk about the state of the industry, a couple of subsectors of the environmental, ornamental, horticulture industry, and then make a transition to talk about a couple of research projects and how those findings tie in with the overall situation and insights for the industry. So I want to start with talking about two sectors, the plant and flower growing industry. So these are our growers, and then on the right-hand side is the retail industry. So overall, the revenue in 2017 was over $13 billion across the US, but Florida is ranked only second to California, so we're a pretty big producer state. In terms of retail sector, Florida ranks, we're among 4 or 5 top states in terms of revenue. And this has historically been sort of the ranking of Florida within the overall national industry. Next, what I want to show is the number of enterprises that compared to 2004, now in 2017, they were down about by 9,000 enterprises, and even more in terms of establishments because an enterprise has multiple location and establishments. So this trend kind of points towards consolidation, and some of the challenges in the industry point to a mature industry and some of the challenges that come with that. But next, what I want to show, kind of be consistent with the previous speakers, show the gap between our imports and exports. As you can see, and I'm not going to talk about anything on the right-hand side from the red line. This is our projection, and I'm not really good at that forecasting. But I do want to point out that imports gradually increased over the last decade or so, but the exports kind of stayed flat across the same time period. So this gap is equivalent of about 12% of domestic demand. So there is an opportunity to capture at least some of that gap by the domestic producer. And so what I talk about in my consumer research part of the talk, hopefully some of these findings will point to some insights that could be used by the industry to be more competitive domestically and internationally. What I have here is the revenue chart for the grower industry, so NAICS code 11142 to be precise. And as you can see, the big dip, that's around the Great Recession that we have. This is very natural, and usually demand for these, the products produced by this industry are tied with residential construction and existing home sales figures. So after that, if you pay attention to the last 3 years or so, the revenue streams is pretty flat. For the retail industry, the picture is a bit different. And so this sector is doing relatively better than growers. But again, looking at the previous several years, again, 3 or 4 years going back, the revenue streams were not really, there were not dramatic changes there. So I guess so this dynamic is kind of pointing to, like I said, a mature industry, and that is characterized by either a slow growth or no growth at all. We saw the numbers pointing to consolidation in the industry, and overall there is decreasing demand for products produced by this industry. So some of the innovators today are way ahead of the curve in terms of producing plants with purpose, well, they're not in the plant business, they're in the business of selling, happiness experience. A company right here in Apopka called Life Trends, they source their little succulents here locally, and then they produce their home decor. It's plants fused with home decor, they're selling experience. And they're way ahead of the curve, and they understand the novelty of the attribute. That's what captures the consumer of these industry products. So my research, or part of my research at least, looks at a couple of attributes, and one of them locally grown. So there is, of course, big trend in demand for locally grown products. So one part of my research looks at how people respond to information or to stimuli that points to locally produced attribute. And the other, so the locally grown can be considered sort of an economic contribution type attribute. And the other side that gets into decision-making process is something people tie with environmental benefits of what they do, what they choose. And of course, there is third one, it's health benefits. So economic, environmental, and health or personal benefits are the three main components that people consider when making decisions about ornamental plant purchases. So I try to do research and find out more how people respond to that information. So then hopefully that information is useful in repositioning and making products that are with purpose and something that customers value. So to do that, I'm going to give a brief background on both the locally produced products, and then in terms of environmental, I'm going to focus on an attribute called pollinator friendly and focus a little bit about pollinator friendly. So it has to do with the neonicotinoid pesticide recent regulation and some mandatory labeling that is moving forward in the industry. So this is not new, of course. The goal of the state agricultural promotion programs are to increase overall awareness of the product, the locally grown aspect of it, and then of course increase demand. Back 2 decades ago, it was only 25 states that had the program, but as of 2015, it's all 50 states. Just add the word grown to the state name, you got your state program. So we reviewed some literature, and almost every single piece we reviewed points to increased willingness to pay, increased preference when, and it's natural, right? If you're doing surveys like state, overall there is preference for domestic production and then even more for local. Although we do have a paper in which we talk about misperceptions of local, so that's some 1/5 of our 1,700 sample confused local being necessarily organic. So that there are some challenges there as well. So in Florida, we have this program running since early 2000, I believe, even late 90s. Citrus, fruits and other fruits and vegetables, seafood even. But when it comes to ornamental plants, this is the industry I predominantly work with, there are just a few of these programs. So there are studies on measuring change in preferences or willingness to pay based on this Mississippi Medallion program, for example, or the Texas Superstar program that was linked with increased willingness to pay. But in Florida, only in 2014, and thanks to FNGLA, the ornamental industry got included and started collaborating with FTACs to have this agriculture promotional program in terms of its production ornamental plants. And so knowing from Dr. Hodges' research how important the contribution of this industry is in the state, even small changes due to this promotional program could end up having higher returns, significant returns for the industry. So now I want to switch to the environment-related attribute, what I call pollinator friendly. And to do that, I guess this audience is informed enough to know the importance of the ecosystem services provided by not only commercial bees, but just pollinators overall. So 70% of 124 food crops worldwide. The economic contributions in the United States only reach about $24 billion, and 15 out of that is due to honeybees. Of course, the debate whether neonic pesticides harm pollinators is not new, but what is new is the speed of information that people are being informed or misinformed. Of course, I'm not an entomologist and I don't do efficacy studies, but I do work on grant projects. And what I learned from my fellow researchers who are doing just that, there is no single connection between the use of neonicotinoid pesticides and the harm that they supposedly do to pollinators. There are a variety of factors. So some of them are listed here. Nutrition could be a problem. Parasites could be genetic problems. And pesticides could be, depending how you use it, of course. But like I said, the speed of information that compared 20, 30 years ago is absolutely not the same. In fact, the other day, Alan Hodges and I were on a tour in Georgia, where I couldn't believe the grower. So he got a phone call from someone right in the garden center. She found out the number, it was on the pot or through the garden center operator. So she made a phone call to the producer saying, tell me whether or not this plant was grown using neonic pesticides. Now, I don't know where her information was coming from. Was she pro or against? But, and I couldn't believe his response was, lady, how do I know what we use for that particular plant? I was like, I can't believe you just had the response to, what if you were speaking with, I don't know, Martha Stewart? It could be one tweet, right? And then, you're talking about collective reputation of the industry. You can't deal with the customer who is demanding that information. So whether or not consumers are misinformed, that's not really the point. Actually, it's a big problem, but it's not the only point. The point is that big retailers do respond to what consumers want these days, and they are being proactive. For example, Home Depot came up with this mandatory labeling that plants that were treated with neonics, it should be indicated on the label, and they control the whole information that goes on the label. Home Depot does. So whether there is indeed harm to pollinators, again, it's being debated now. But what retailers did, they're moving towards the direction. And in 2018, which is this year, they're not gonna accept any plants that were treated with neonics. And if you speak with the industry, some of them are fine. Some of them stopped using it years ago. Some of them are ready to switch, but some of them aren't. They don't have the biological or alternative practices that would guarantee the same yield or same quality of plants that they're producing. Anyway, so this is kind of an important attribute, important in terms of consumer demand and the response to some of the labeling. A lot of research on the producer side, but we don't know how would consumers respond and how would that change their preferences and demand for plants that were grown using neonics. So I guess, of course, increased urbanization, it does fragment pollinator habitat, but also it can be used as an opportunity to educate the homeowners and convert at least some of the 90 million households that could potentially have yards or gardens, to convert some of that into pollinator gardens. So that way the consumer response will be positive, good news for the industry. So there's a huge potential for both academic research and outreach, and also industry has a lot to do in terms of being proactive and not turning down consumers who demand information about their practices. So kind of following these two background stories, so what I tried to do in these two research projects, which I'm gonna present now briefly, this is just a snapshot of the research results, but you will have an idea. To focus on how people respond to when the plants are labeled pollinator friendly, also when they're labeled as grown locally. Fresh from Florida label was, the program was our focus because of course, the grant came through FTAX, and there was priority to focus, kind of trying to understand how effective the program is, if there are opportunities for the industry to engage more with the program. And so what I want to have a couple of slides here talking about the consumer behavior and the Insights Lab, which is right down the hall here on the very last room on your left. After lunch, if you have time, please feel free to stop by and I can elaborate more on what we're doing and show you some of the equipment we have. So on this slide, I'm showing what I call stationary eye tracking stations. Usually we use these when we have smaller visual stimuli to work with, such as layers. We need some close-ups. And we use mobile eye tracking for bigger stimuli, such as store shelves and images of front yards, for example. There is a lot of research showing the benefits of using visual attention measures in consumer research. And just to point to a couple, I won't go through the whole literature, but about 83% of information that we receive is visually. The rest comes through different sensory inputs, but 83% is visually. And only 2% of the visual field actually gets processed and to then be used in decision making. So we do glance, we do accept a lot of visual stimuli, but we use only a fraction of that to make a decision. And of course, we behave differently when there is choice overload. We behave differently visually if there is time constraint. So this is kind of interesting input to the conventional methods we used to use in consumer research. So just take a look at this and let me know what you see. What do you think you see in this image? What I see, plants, a shelf, and some signs. But if I point you, I hope it works. Okay, I think I should. And Dave, do you know how to click on the video?
Is it a video?
Yeah.
Is it local or is it online?
No, it's local. I need to get out of the laser, the pointer. Okay, just yeah. So if you do this experiment with about 100 people and stack up the data, you will see that only part of the stimuli is actually being viewed. And so this part where you see the color and the signs where the information was less attention on the shelf or pots, or something that is not visually attractive like the foliage part, right? So what I want to show next, these are some of the attributes we use in research. We try to have different information in each scenario and we change them. So but we're going to focus on the pollinator-friendly attribute and the locally grown attribute. So we present different scenarios changing the location and information in the slides, and we collect visual attention information in addition to their choices that they make. And then we draw what we call areas of interest on each of those slides, and we select information, visual attention information per AOI, area of interest. And now we have for every individual, for every slide, we have how much attention they pay to each of these attributes, right? And so let's keep the demographic here, it's pretty typical. But what we find from our regression analysis is that, first of all, attributes, without going into visual measures yet, the attributes pollinator friendly and fresh from Florida had positive impact on their preferences, on their purchase likelihood. Well, later we use this to derive willingness to pay, but next one I want to show is fixation counts. So the number of times they fixated on those attributes was positively correlated with their choices. So the more they view these parts of the image, the more likely they were to choose the product. And the willingness to pay for a pollinator-friendly attribute and locally grown was $1.80 and $6 respectively. So overall, there's a lot of demand for pollinator-friendly plants, and having the label increases likelihood to purchase. But of course, when we ask them more questions, only 1/5 of them heard about neonics. So wherever the information is coming from, the preference is questionable. And out of that 20%, only 10% of the total sample actually knows about neonics. And this is self-reported, and when we dig deeper into what they mean when they say we know it, turns out almost nobody knows about neonics. Because as a researcher, we have a hard time understanding how they work. So the general public, they have no understanding whatsoever. But they will use their knowledge that comes from wherever media or sources that tend to be not scientific, to use that information to search for keywords in a retail setting. And some of them, you see the brown spike, those are the people who are supposedly neonic aware. So they would be okay with having a label that says neonic free. And we know they don't know anything about neonics. So this is going to have some, I guess, implications for retail. So the next study I want to briefly go through has the similar setting, but here we are just changing the attributes because these are fruit producing, so we don't have the pollinator friendly. These are more like ornamental, growing for ornamental purposes. So we do focus on the origin though, and fresh from Florida again is the focus. So we do typical experiment here, and instead of the shelf, now we have a close-up of a label because most of these fruit-producing plants don't have the fruit at the time when they are being purchased. So similar procedures, and when we look at the results, again, similar trend across 3 different models. We tried the in-state attribute, the logo. When they see the logo, it is something positive that influences their decision-making. We try to dig a bit deeper into what makes them think the local is advantageous, what makes them choose local. And so we focused on environmental considerations, something they thought would contribute to the local economy, or that local ends up having higher quality because travels less miles, or just local production is more trustworthy. So we try to incorporate those results into regression models, and what we find is, in addition to fixation counts, in addition to visual measures being positive, what we find that when we dissect it into 3 different perceptions, environmental, local economy contribution, and quality, it turns out that local economy consideration is what drives their visual attention to it, and then through that it has positive influence on their choice decisions. And then we convert these results, of course, to willingness to pay results, and so in this case it was over $7. So I'm almost done. What we try to do with these different projects, we had another one that focused on health attributes, volatile organic compound removal, for example, was a study that we incorporated with houseplants. And so try to incorporate these environmental benefits, economic benefits, and health considerations, how those could be used by the industry to increase awareness and demand for their products. So we publish the results in terms of simpler message for the industry. We go to industry journals. Some of them have $25,000, $30,000, $40,000 member distribution. So the word gets out to the industry, and I hope some of them will at least find it useful. So this is all I had. Like I said, if you have any more to hear from me, I'll be in the lab and be happy to speak.